My name is Sarah Nolan, and I'm 41 years old. This happened last fall during a solo trip to Cimarron Canyon State Park in New Mexico. I'm a wildlife photographer, and I often travel alone, seeking out remote locations to capture the kind of shots that few people get to see. I've camped in all kinds of wilderness, from deserts to rainforests, but I've never been as terrified as I was that week in the canyon. I arrived at Cimarron Canyon in the early afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows through the towering pines. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a crisp breeze hinting at the coming winter. My RV was stocked with supplies, and I had my camera bag slung over my shoulder. It was the perfect spot to spend a few days in solitude. The ranger station had been empty when I arrived, but that wasn't unusual in remote parks. I picked a secluded pull-off near the river and set up camp. The scenery was incredible. Jagged cliffs rising in the distance, trees painted in hues of gold and crimson. I couldn't wait to start exploring. As I wandered along the edge of the forest, my camera clicking away, I noticed something strange. Symbols, etched into the bark of trees and carved into stones. They weren't graffiti, at least not the kind I'd ever seen. Twisted spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like crude humanoid figures. Some of the carvings had dark stains on them, as if someone had poured ink or blood over the marks. I took a few photos, telling myself they were just old carvings left by bored campers or hunters. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. That night, the first storm rolled in. I was reviewing the day's shots in the RV when I heard the wind pick up, whistling through the canyon like a warning. My lights flickered briefly, and I thought I heard something outside, a faint, high-pitched giggle, almost too soft to be real. I turned off the lights and peered through the window. The moonlight spilled across the ground, illuminating the forest's edge. There was no one there, but my breath fogged the glass as I stared, heart pounding. It had to be the wind. Still, I double-checked that the doors were locked before crawling into bed. The next morning, I met Matt and Casey Woods. They were a young couple camped about a mile down the trail, their tent nestled near the riverbank. Casey waved me over as I passed, her friendly smile a relief after the previous night's unease. "You're camping alone?" she asked, handing me a mug of coffee. "Yeah," I said. "I'm a photographer, just here for a few days to shoot the wildlife and scenery." Matt glanced at the forest, his expression unreadable. "You're not worried about the witch?" I laughed, thinking it was a joke. "The witch?" Casey frowned, nudging him. "Don't scare her." Matt shrugged. "It's just an old story. Locals say a witch haunts these woods. Supposedly, she was killed here by settlers a couple of 100 years ago. They accused her of cursing their crops or something." "She was innocent," Casey added softly. "At least, that's how the story goes. But her spirit's supposed to guard the canyon now, punishing anyone who disrespects the forest." I raised an eyebrow. "You believe that?" Casey hesitated. "I didn't until last night. We heard things." Matt cut her off. "Coyotes. It was just coyotes." But I could see the unease in his eyes. By the time I returned to my RV, clouds had gathered again, and the air felt heavier, charged with electricity. I told myself Matt and Casey were just superstitious, but their words lingered in my mind. As I prepared for another night, I noticed something scratched into the door of my RV. A symbol, one of the twisted spirals I'd seen in the forest. It hadn't been there before. My skin prickled, but I brushed it off as a prank. Maybe Matt or Casey thought it'd be funny to spook me. That night, the forest came alive. The storm hit just after midnight, rain pounding against the RV's roof. The wind howled, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to circle my campsite. I lay in bed, clutching my flashlight, when I heard the sound of something or someone moving outside. I crept to the window, my heart hammering. At first, I saw nothing but darkness and the faint glint of raindrops. Then, lightning flashed, illuminating the trees. A figure stood at the forest's edge, cloaked, with glowing eyes that pierced through the night. I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the floor. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The next day, I decided to confront Matt and Casey. I needed to know if they'd seen anything, or if they were responsible for the scratches on my RV. But when I reached their campsite, it was deserted. Their tent was still there, along with their supplies, but there was no sign of them. The ground was muddy from the rain, and I could see their footprints leading into the forest. They didn't come back out. I debated calling the park rangers, but quickly realized I had no cell service. My stomach twisted with unease as I noticed the same runic symbols etched into the trees surrounding their campsite. That afternoon, the forest began to change. Paths I'd walked the day before now looped back on themselves, leading me in circles. My camera, which had been working perfectly, started glitching. When I reviewed the shots, they were warped and distorted, with shadowy figures lurking at the edges of the frame. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the air grow colder. The forest was too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects replaced by an oppressive stillness. I heard Casey's voice calling my name. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Help us." I froze, scanning the trees. "Casey, where are you?" Her voice came again, softer now. "Sarah, please." Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, pushing deeper into the forest. The light faded quickly, and soon I was navigating by flashlight alone. Then I saw her. Casey stood between two trees, her hair damp, her face pale and blank. Her lips moved, but the words were unintelligible. As I stepped closer, she raised her hand, pointing behind me. I turned, and the world seemed to tilt. The witch stood there, her tattered cloak blending into the shadows. Her eyes glowed like embers, and her face was a hollow skeletal mask. I stumbled back, tripping over a root. When I looked again, she was gone. Casey was gone. I ran back to the RV, shaking and out of breath. The door was open, though I was certain I'd locked it. Inside, the air was freezing, and the symbols carved into the walls seemed to shimmer faintly, as if alive. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat, clutching my flashlight and waiting for dawn. The next morning, I tried to leave. The RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, no matter how many times I turned the key. I stepped outside to check the tires and found them sunk deep into the mud. Desperation clawed at me as I noticed fresh footprints leading away from the RV, barefoot, like a child's, but elongated and unnatural. I knew then that I wasn't alone. That evening, the witch came for me. The air grew thick, the sky darkening as though the sun had vanished entirely. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping until they formed a chorus of voices. She appeared in the doorway, her skeletal frame towering, her eyes burning into mine. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. I backed away, fumbling for my camera. Without thinking, I snapped a photo, the flash lighting up the interior of the RV. The witch recoiled, her form flickering like a dying flame. Seizing the moment, I grabbed my camera bag and ran. I don't know how I found my way out of the forest. The paths twisted and shifted, the trees pressing closer together as though trying to trap me. But somehow, I emerged onto the main road just as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds. When I turned back, the canyon was silent. I never saw Matt or Casey again. My RV was eventually towed out of the mud, but the marks remained, both on the walls and on my arm, where the witch's symbol still glows faintly in the dark. I haven't returned to Cimarron Canyon since, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I feel her watching, and I know the forest hasn't forgotten me. My name is Eric Lawson, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last October while I was traveling through New Mexico for a story I was writing about lesser-known camping spots. I've been a travel writer for nearly 10 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange places, but nothing ever prepared me for what happened at Perch Creek. I arrived at the outskirts of Caballo Lake State Park late in the afternoon. The air was crisp, the sunlight golden as it filtered through the sparse desert trees. My RV hummed as I pulled into a small, secluded area near Perch Creek. The location wasn't listed as an official campsite, but that's what drew me to it. I was always on the hunt for hidden gems to feature in my articles. The creek itself was unassuming, a shallow ribbon of water winding through a bed of smooth stones and dry reeds. The area was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the brush. Perfect, I thought. Isolated and picturesque. As I stepped out to set up camp, I noticed an older woman walking by the road. She must have been in her late 60s, with sun-weathered skin and silver hair tied back in a loose braid. She stopped when she saw me, her expression guarded. "You camping out here?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of concern. "Yeah," I said with a friendly nod. "I'm a writer, exploring the area for an article." Her eyes narrowed. Perch Creek's not a good place to stay overnight. I laughed nervously. "Why's that? Coyotes?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the creek. "The creek keeps what it takes," she said finally, her tone low and serious. "You should go somewhere else." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked away. I watched her disappear down the road, her words lingering uneasily in my mind. I shook it off. Every small town has its ghost stories, I told myself. People just like to scare outsiders. The first few hours passed without incident. I took photos of the creek, capturing the light as it shimmered on the water, and wrote a few notes for my article. As night fell, I made myself dinner on the small stove in my RV and settled in for a quiet evening. That's when I saw it. A red ball floated lazily in the creek, bobbing on the water's surface. I hadn't noticed it earlier, and it struck me as odd. There weren't any other campers around, and the nearest town was miles away. Curious, I stepped out of the RV with my flashlight to get a closer look. The ball drifted toward the bank, as if drawn by an invisible hand. It stopped just at the edge of the water. I crouched to pick it up, but hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. The plastic was faded and cracked, like it had been in the water for years. I tossed it back into the creek and returned to the RV, locking the door behind me. The first night was restless. Around midnight, I woke to the faint sound of children laughing. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I sat up, the sound grew clearer. It was coming from outside. I peered through the window, scanning the area with my flashlight. The creek shimmered faintly in the moonlight, but there was no one there. Still, the laughter continued. Soft, playful, and utterly out of place. I climbed back into bed, convincing myself it was just the wind, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I decided to explore the creek more thoroughly. As I walked along the bank, I noticed something strange, small, barefoot tracks in the mud. They were too small to belong to an adult and too fresh to be old. They led to the water's edge and stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into the creek. My skin prickled. but I shook off the unease and took a few photos. When I reviewed them later, I noticed something chilling. Small, pale faces reflected in the water. They were blurry, like they were caught mid-movement, but there was no denying what I saw. That evening, the malfunctions began. The RV's lights flickered sporadically, plunging me into darkness before blinking back on. My camera refused to focus when aimed at the creek, capturing only distorted images of twisted trees and shadowy figures. By nightfall, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and howling through the brush. As I sat at my small dining table trying to write, I heard it again. The laughter. It was louder this time, accompanied by faint whispers I couldn't quite make out. I froze as a soft thud echoed from the RV door. Slowly, I approached and peered through the small window. The red ball was sitting on the step, glistening as if freshly pulled from the water. The second night was worse. I woke to the sound of tiny footsteps running across the roof. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The desert was silent, the sky a vast expanse of stars. But as I turned to look at the RV, my blood ran cold. Small, wet handprints covered the windows, trailing down like tears. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I saw them. 3 figures standing by the creek. They were children, their pale faces blank and expressionless. Water dripped from their clothes as they stared at me, unmoving. "Who are you?" I called, my voice cracking. They didn't answer. Instead, they stepped into the water, one by one, and disappeared beneath the surface. By morning, I was desperate to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could, but as I started the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but it refused to start. Panic crept in as I realized I was stranded. The day passed in a haze of unease. I stayed inside, avoiding the creek, but the sense of being watched was inescapable. By evening, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. As darkness fell, I heard the lullaby. It was faint at first, like a distant melody carried on the breeze, but it grew louder, more distorted, until it seemed to echo inside the RV. I covered my ears, but it didn't stop. The sound was everywhere. The door creaked open. I turned, frozen in terror, as the ball rolled inside. It stopped at my feet and the lullaby ceased. For a moment there was silence. Then they appeared. The children stood in the doorway, their empty eyes fixed on me. Water pooled around their feet, spreading across the floor. One of them smiled, a ghastly, unnatural grin, and held out a hand. "Come play with us," he whispered. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed the ball and threw it into the RV's stove. The plastic melted instantly, releasing a foul, acrid smoke. The children screamed, their voices high and piercing, and vanished in a burst of wind that slammed the door shut. The lights flickered one last time before the RV roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I drove away, not stopping until I reached the next town. I've since tried to make sense of what happened, but the truth is, I don't think I ever will. I told the story to a local historian, who confirmed that several children drowned in Perch Creek during a flash flood in the 1950s. Their bodies were never recovered. Even now, I can't forget their faces. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the lullaby, and I know the creek hasn't forgotten me either. My name is Mia Rivera, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in October of last year, during what was supposed to be a fun camping trip to El Malpais National Monument in New Mexico. I'd planned the trip for weeks, excited to explore the ancient volcanic fields and lava tubes with my boyfriend Jake and a couple of our friends. But what I thought would be a weekend of adventure turned into something I still can't fully explain, a nightmare that none of us will ever forget. We arrived at the monument on a sunny Friday afternoon. I'd picked this spot because of its unique geology. The sprawling lava fields, jagged rock formations, and massive underground lava tubes were irresistible to a geology nerd like me. Jake, my boyfriend, loved anything that got his adrenaline pumping, and exploring the rugged terrain seemed right up his alley. Jake's best friend, Rob Bennett, tagged along, claiming he wanted to prove he wasn't scared of a few rocks. Tasha, my 25-year-old cousin, joined us for her first big camping trip, eager to photograph the striking landscape for her portfolio. "This place is wild," Tasha said, as we set up camp near the edge of a lava field. She snapped picture after picture of the barren landscape, her camera clicking like a metronome. "You're not kidding," Rob said, tossing his tent bag on the ground. "Looks like Mars. Are we sure we're still on Earth?" Jake laughed. "Don't worry, Rob. If we get lost, Mia will save us with her super science skills." I rolled my eyes but smiled. That was Jake for you, always teasing but secretly trusting me to keep things in check. The first sign that something was off came that evening. We were sitting around the fire eating the hot dogs Jake had burned to a crisp when the wind picked up. It wasn't unusual for the breeze to get stronger after sunset, but this wind had a strange quality to it. It carried faint sounds, whispers that I couldn't quite make out. "Do you hear that?" Tasha asked, lowering her camera. "Hear what?" Jake replied, stuffing a marshmallow into his mouth. "The wind. It sounds like, I don't know, like people talking." "Probably just coyotes," Rob said dismissively. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. I told myself it was just the wind funneling through the jagged rocks, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. When we finally turned in for the night, I lay awake in my tent listening. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a faint voice. It sounded like someone calling my name. The next morning, things got worse. Guys," Jake said, as we packed up for a day hike. He held up one of the tent poles from his pack. It was bent at an impossible angle. "Explain this." "Did you step on it?" I asked, though I knew that kind of damage wasn't normal. "Nope, it was fine last night." "Maybe it's a sign we shouldn't go exploring," Tasha said, half joking. Rob snorted. "What's next? Haunted tent poles? Let's get moving before Mia geeks out over some rocks for 5 hours." I shot him a look but didn't argue. We packed what we needed and set off toward one of the larger lava tubes a couple of miles away. The hike was grueling. The sharp edges of the lava rocks made every step treacherous, and by the time we reached the entrance of the tube, we were all scratched and bruised. "This is it," Jake said, peering into the dark opening. The tube yawned like the mouth of some ancient beast, its walls streaked with shades of black and gray. "Are we sure about this?" Tasha asked, clutching her camera. "Don't tell me you're scared," Rob said. "It's just a cave." "It's not a cave," I corrected. "It's a lava tube. These were formed when molten lava flowed under hardened rock thousands of years ago." Yeah, let's get in there already," Jake said, grabbing a flashlight. Reluctantly, we followed him inside. The tube was massive, its walls smooth and cold to the touch. Our voices echoed eerily, and the beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness ahead. Tasha snapped pictures nervously, her camera's flash briefly illuminating the strange, rippled patterns on the walls. Then her camera started acting up. "What the hell?" she muttered, fiddling with the settings. "It keeps glitching." "What kind of glitch?" I asked, leaning over to look. She showed me the screen. The last photo she'd taken was distorted, blurry and smeared, with a dark, humanoid shape in the background. "Did you see that when you took the picture?" I asked. trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head. "It's just a shadow," Jake said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Probably one of us." We kept moving, but the air felt heavier, like we were descending into something we shouldn't be part of. It was Rob who heard it first. "Stop," he said suddenly, holding up his hand. "What is it?" I asked. "Listen." The tube fell silent, except for the faint dripping of water somewhere far away. Then I heard it, a voice. It was distant but unmistakable. "Help, me." It sounded like Tasha. "That's not funny," Tasha said, looking at Rob. "It wasn't me," Rob said, his face pale. Jake's grip on his flashlight tightened. "Let's go back. Now." We turned to leave, but the tube behind us was darker than it should have been. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. And then I saw it. A figure crouched in the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Too long, too thin, its limbs bending unnaturally. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted, stumbling over the uneven ground as the thing moved behind us, its footsteps eerily silent. Tasha screamed as her camera slipped from her hands and shattered on the rocks. When we finally burst into the sunlight, the figure stopped at the tube's entrance, retreating into the darkness. "Everyone okay?" I asked, panting. Tasha nodded, tears streaming down her face. Rob didn't answer. He was staring at the entrance, his face frozen in terror. "Rob," Jake said, shaking his shoulder. Rob blinked and turned to us. "It's still in there." That night, we packed up camp, too afraid to stay. But as we loaded our gear, we heard it again, the voice calling for help. This time, it sounded like Rob. "Don't listen to it," I said firmly. "It's trying to trick us." But Rob hesitated. "What if someone's really out there?" "Rob, no," Tasha said, grabbing his arm. He shook her off and walked toward the voice. Jake and I ran after him, but by the time we reached the edge of the lava field, he was gone. We searched for hours, calling his name, but he never answered. By dawn, we had no choice but to leave. Tasha was inconsolable, and even Jake looked shaken. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing on the horizon, watching us. It looked like Rob, but his eyes glowed faintly, just like the thing in the tube. I still have nightmares about that trip. Tasha's photos revealed more than we realized at the time, shadowy figures lurking in the background of almost every shot. We reported Rob missing, but the search parties never found him. Deep down, I know what happened to him. The skinwalker took him, and it's still out there waiting. My name is Jack Monroe. I'm 32 years old, and I used to think camping was the one thing that could quiet my mind. It was my therapy, my way of dealing with the noise inside my head. But last October, at Hyde Memorial State Park near Santa Fe, New Mexico, I learned that silence can be worse than noise. Sometimes, silence is where the real horrors live. I went to the park alone. That's how I preferred it, just me, my RV, and the woods. This trip was supposed to be different, though. It wasn't just about escaping the world, it was about facing my past. My younger sister Ella died when she was 10, and I've never forgiven myself. I wasn't there for her when she got sick. I was 17, more interested in hanging out with friends than sitting by her hospital bed. Even now, all these years later, I still hear her favorite lullaby in my head, like she's trying to remind me of the brother I should have been. I thought the solitude of the mountains might help me find some kind of closure. Instead, I found something else entirely. Hyde Memorial State Park was beautiful, especially in the fall. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains were ablaze with golden aspens, their leaves drifting lazily to the forest floor. The air was crisp and cool, perfect for hiking and journaling. I picked a remote campsite deep in the woods, far from the families and weekend warriors. Just the way I liked it. The first day passed uneventfully. I parked my RV in a clearing, set up a small fire pit, and spent the afternoon walking one of the quieter trails. The forest was serene, almost unnaturally so. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. I made a quick dinner on my portable stove and settled into a camp chair to watch the stars. That was when I heard it. The sound of children giggling. It was faint at first, like it was carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to listen. The laughter came again, clearer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of small feet running across the gravel. My first thought was that someone else was camping nearby. Maybe their kids had wandered over. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone there?" The laughter stopped. Silence. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the edge of the clearing. The beam caught only trees and shadows. Shaking my head, I laughed nervously and muttered, "Just the wind." But as I turned back toward the RV, the beam of my flashlight landed on something that made my stomach drop. A small dirty doll lying in the middle of the clearing. I hadn't seen it there before. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the doll had been there all along, dropped by a previous camper. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered as I set out on another hike. I chose a trail marked as moderate on the map, hoping to clear my head. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed off. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air felt colder too, almost unnaturally so. Then I saw it. An old, abandoned campsite tucked into a grove of aspens. The tent was sagging and moldy, its fabric ripped in places. Rusted cans and broken toys were scattered around the site. A small shoe lay overturned near the fire pit, its laces frayed. Curious, I stepped closer and noticed a journal lying half buried in the dirt. I picked it up and flipped through the brittle pages. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. One entry stood out. "They won't stop crying. They keep calling for me, but when I look, they're gone. I don't know what to do. My babies. Where are my babies?" I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. I didn't know what had happened here, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I returned to camp just as the sun was setting. The clearing felt different now, more menacing. The doll was still there, but now it was propped up against the RV door, as if someone, or something, had placed it there intentionally. "Okay, very funny," I said out loud, though my voice wavered. "Whoever's out there, this isn't funny anymore." No answer. That night, the silence was suffocating. I tried to distract myself by writing in my journal, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was the journal I'd found, the abandoned campsite, and the doll. Then, around midnight, the voices started again. This time, they weren't laughing. They were crying. Soft, pitiful sobs that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Help us," a small voice whimpered. My chest tightened. "Who's there?" I shouted, grabbing my flashlight. The sobbing stopped, but as I swept the beam of light across the clearing, I saw them. 3 small figures standing just beyond the tree line. They were children, or at least they looked like children. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "Stay back!" I yelled, though my voice cracked. "I'm warning you." The figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching me. Then, slowly, one of them stepped forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. "You didn't save us," it said, its voice hollow and accusatory. My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" The figure tilted its head as if confused. Then it vanished, along with the others, leaving me alone in the clearing. I stumbled back into the RV, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the latch. Inside, the air felt colder than it had outside. That was when I noticed the writing on the window. Words scrawled in condensation that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Why didn't you protect us?" I didn't sleep that night. The cries continued, growing louder and more desperate as the hours dragged on. The shadows outside the RV seemed to move, shifting and twisting like living things. At one point, I thought I saw my sister's face in the window, her eyes filled with sorrow. By dawn, I'd had enough. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, barely pausing to eat. As I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, I heard a faint voice behind me. "Jack!" I turned, my heart pounding, but no one was there. The drive out of the park was nerve-wracking. The road seemed longer than it had on the way in, the trees pressing closer on either side. Every so often I thought I saw movement in the rearview mirror, small figures darting between the trees, always just out of sight. I made it home in one piece, but I haven't been the same since. The doll, the journal, the voices, they haunt me even now. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the cries. And every so often, when I look out my window, I see a small figure standing in the shadows. I thought this trip would help me find closure, but it only opened old wounds. I don't know what those children wanted, or why they chose me. Maybe they saw the guilt I carry. Maybe they thought I could save them. Or maybe they just wanted me to suffer, the way they did. If you ever find yourself at Hyde Memorial State Park, listen carefully. If you hear children crying, don't answer. And whatever you do, don't look back. My name is Caleb Dunn, and I'm 28 years old. I've spent most of my life chasing the past, studying the fragments of ancient civilizations to uncover their secrets. Last summer, I took my RV to Chaco Culture National Historical Park in New Mexico, hoping to document some lesser-known petroglyphs for a research paper. What I found there, what I experienced, has made me question everything I thought I knew about the past and about the world we live in. I didn't tell anyone this story before. If I had, no one would have believed me. But it happened. I know it happened. I arrived at Chaco Canyon in late August, driving my old RV down the dusty road leading to the park. The area is remote, surrounded by arid desert and jagged mesas. It's beautiful in its desolation, a perfect place for solitude and research. My mentor, Carla Baines, had told me about a set of petroglyphs carved near a place called the Devil's Forks, where two canyons meet. They're warnings, Carla had said over the phone. Ancient Puebloan people carved them to keep something out. Or maybe to keep something in. Don't stay there after dark, Caleb. I'm serious. I laughed it off at the time. Carla was brilliant, but she had a superstitious streak I'd never understood. Don't worry, I told her. I'll be careful. As I parked my RV near the trailhead that led to the Devil's Forks, I noticed a ranger watching me from a distance. When I got out, he walked over, dusting his hat off against his leg. "You heading to the Forks?" he asked, his tone wary. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He scratched the back of his neck. "Just don't camp too close. Strange things happen there at night." "What kind of strange things?" I asked, trying not to sound amused. "People hear voices, see things they can't explain, sometimes they don't come back. Got it. Thanks for the warning, I said, brushing him off. He shook his head and walked away, muttering something I couldn't hear. The hike to the Devil's Forks took me through a labyrinth of canyons, their red stone walls towering over me like ancient sentinels. By mid-afternoon, I reached the spot, a narrow clearing where the canyons converged. The petroglyphs were everywhere, etched into the rock faces in intricate, overlapping patterns. They depicted humanoid figures with elongated limbs and faces twisted into animal-like shapes. Wolves, deer, and something that resembled a bird, but wasn't quite right. As I studied the carvings, a strange sensation crept over me, like I was being watched. I turned around, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the clearing was empty. Get a grip, Caleb, I muttered to myself and began setting up my equipment. I spent the next few hours photographing and sketching the petroglyphs, noting their details. The most unsettling carvings were clustered on one rock face near the edge of the clearing. They depicted figures with clawed hands and horned heads, surrounding a human figure that seemed to be kneeling or cowering. Something about those carvings felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. By the time I finished, the sun was sinking behind the canyon walls, and shadows stretched long across the clearing. I debated hiking back to the RV, but decided to stay. It wasn't the first time I'd camped overnight at a site like this, and I wanted to observe the area after dark. As I set up my camp, the air grew unnaturally cold. My flashlight flickered when I turned it on, even though I'd replaced the batteries that morning. I shrugged it off and built a small fire, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. That's when I heard the scratching. It was faint at first, like a branch scraping against rock. I looked up, scanning the clearing, but saw nothing. Then the sound came again, louder this time, as if it were circling me. Probably just an animal, I said out loud, though my voice didn't sound convincing. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing. It landed on a rock face, and for a split second I thought I saw movement, something dark slipping behind the petroglyphs. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was a trick of the light. That night, I woke to the sound of growling. It was low and guttural, coming from somewhere outside my RV. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the same scratching sound I'd heard earlier. I reached for my phone to call Carla, but there was no signal. The growling stopped, replaced by a faint tapping on the RV's window. I turned my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. There, pressed against the glass, was the outline of a face. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Before I could react, it vanished, leaving only a faint smudge on the window. I sat in the RV, shaking until dawn. The next day I tried to leave, but my RV wouldn't start. The battery, which had been fine the day before, was completely drained. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike back to the main road, hoping to flag down a ranger or another camper. But as I retraced my steps, the landscape seemed different. The canyons felt narrower, the trails more winding. I passed the same rock formations multiple times as if I were walking in circles. By late afternoon, I found myself back at the Devil's Forks, even though I was certain I'd been walking away from it. Frustrated and scared, I climbed to the top of a nearby ridge to get a better view of the area. From there, I could see the petroglyphs below, and something else. A large, shadowy figure moving through the clearing. As night fell, the figure grew bolder. It stalked the edges of the clearing, staying just out of the firelight. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my notes, but when I looked up again, it was standing in front of the petroglyphs. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with antler-like protrusions on its head and glowing red eyes. Its body was humanoid but distorted, its limbs too long and its fingers ending in claws. It spoke in a deep, guttural voice that seemed to reverberate through the canyon. "You have trespassed," it said. "You must pay." I scrambled back into the RV, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the latch. The entity circled the vehicle, its growls growing louder. Desperate, I grabbed my satellite phone and called Carla. Miraculously, the call went through. "Carla, I need help!" I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't ask questions. She just told me to perform a Navajo blessing she'd taught me during our research. I grabbed the pouch of sage she'd given me months ago, lit it, and began chanting the words she recited over the phone. The growling stopped. The air grew still. When I opened my eyes, the entity was gone. I managed to start the RV the next morning, though I still don't understand how. I drove away without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Back at home, I reviewed the footage from my camera. Most of it was corrupted, but one image was clear. The shadowy figure standing in front of the petroglyphs, its clawed hand raised as if in warning. I haven't told anyone what happened that night, but I've stayed far away from Chaco Canyon ever since. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some secrets are better left buried. My name is Maya Chavez. I'm 24 years old, and I never used to believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of that supernatural nonsense. But what happened to me last fall in the Bisty Wilderness changed that forever. I still wake up some nights to the sound of whispers I can't explain. If I'd known what I was walking into, I never would have gone. But back then, I thought I was smarter than legends. It all started with a thesis. My thesis, to be exact. I'm a graduate student in history, specializing in Navajo culture and mythology. I thought a weekend camping trip to the Bisty/Denazin Wilderness in New Mexico would be the perfect way to collect first-hand research. The area, known for its bizarre rock formations and eerie solitude, has long been tied to Navajo lore, particularly stories about skinwalkers, evil shapeshifters that people are warned not to talk about. I wasn't going alone, though. My younger brother Eli, who's 21, decided to tag along. He's a freelance photographer and thought he could snag some cool shots of the alien-like landscape for his portfolio. My best friend Claire, 25, rounded out our group. She's a no-nonsense camping expert who agreed to help us navigate the wilderness, though she made it clear from the start that she wasn't thrilled about the topic of my research. "This place has bad vibes," Claire warned as we packed up the car. "If you ask me, you're poking around where you don't belong." I just laughed it off. "Relax, Claire. It's just a bunch of stories." The drive out to Bisty was long, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. We arrived late in the afternoon with just enough time to hike to a remote camping spot. The landscape was surreal. Towering hoodoos, strange rock spires, and vast, open silence. It felt like we'd stepped onto another planet. Claire insisted we set up camp before dark, so we found a flat spot near a cluster of rock formations. As we pitched the tent and unpacked our gear, I couldn't help but feel an odd sense of unease. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a nagging feeling that we weren't alone. By sunset, the temperature had dropped sharply. We huddled around a small campfire, eating freeze-dried meals and joking to lighten the mood. Eli took a few photos of the landscape, but his camera kept glitching, refusing to focus. "Stupid thing," he muttered, fiddling with the lens. "This better not ruin my shots." "It's just the cold," I said, though I wasn't sure. Something about the place felt off. That night, the eeriness began. As we lay in the tent, the desert outside was unnervingly silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making you feel like you've gone deaf. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching in the gravel outside. My heart leapt into my throat. At first, I thought it was Claire or Eli, but then I remembered we were all zipped into the same tent. I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Claire, who was lying next to me. She nodded, her eyes wide. "Stay quiet." The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and for a moment, I thought whoever, or whatever it was, might leave. But then, in a low, raspy voice, it whispered my name. "Maya." I bolted upright, my blood running cold. "Eli, cut it out," I hissed, thinking he was trying to scare us. But Eli groaned groggily from his side of the tent, clearly still half asleep. "I didn't say anything," he muttered. "What's going on?" By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination. The desert could play tricks on you, I reasoned, especially in a place as strange as Bisti. Eli and Claire didn't seem as convinced. "We shouldn't stay another night," Claire said over breakfast. "This place is bad news." "We can't leave yet," I argued. "I haven't finished my research, and we haven't even explored the deeper trails." Eli sighed. "Fine. But if I hear one more creepy whisper, I'm out." We packed up and spent the day hiking through the wilderness. The terrain was breathtaking but disorienting, with its labyrinth of canyons and towering rock formations. Claire's GPS started acting up, forcing her to rely on an old paper map. Tensions flared as we argued over which direction to take, but eventually we found a path that seemed promising. That's when we spotted the tracks. They were massive, like wolf tracks, but larger and spaced farther apart. What was even stranger was that they abruptly stopped in the middle of the trail, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. "Coyote?" Eli suggested, though his voice was uncertain. "No coyotes that big," Claire muttered, her face pale. We returned to camp late, exhausted and on edge. As darkness fell, the strange silence returned, heavier than before. Claire burned a small bundle of sage, muttering a prayer under her breath. "Seriously?" I teased. "You think that's going to help?" "Can't hurt," she snapped, glaring at me. "Unlike your dumb thesis." Eli was unusually quiet, sitting by the fire and staring out into the darkness. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked suddenly. "Hear what?" I said, my stomach tightening. "It sounds like crying, like a kid." I strained my ears, but heard nothing. "You're imagining things." "No," he insisted. "It's coming from over there." Before we could stop him, Eli grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the sound. Claire and I followed, panicked, as he disappeared into the shadows. "Eli, wait!" Claire yelled. We caught up to him near a rocky outcrop, where he stood frozen, his flashlight trembling in his hand. In its beam, we saw a figure crouched on the ground. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. It turned toward us, revealing a face that was almost human but distorted, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Run!" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The figure let out a guttural snarl and lunged. We bolted back to camp, adrenaline pumping as the thing chased us. I could hear its claws scraping against the rocks, its guttural breathing growing louder. We reached the camp, but the fire had gone out. The tent was slashed open, and our gear was scattered everywhere. Claire grabbed her sage and started burning it again, chanting a prayer I didn't recognize. "What are you doing?" I screamed. "Trying to keep it away," she yelled. The figure appeared at the edge of the firelight, its form shifting between human and animal. It began to circle us, its glowing eyes fixed on Eli, who was clutching his camera like a lifeline. Then it spoke, mimicking my voice perfectly. "Eli, come here!" Eli's face went white. "What the hell is that?" "It's a skinwalker," Claire said, her voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." But the creature wasn't letting us go that easily. It lunged at Eli, slashing his leg with its claws before retreating back into the shadows. With Eli bleeding and barely able to walk, we had no choice but to flee immediately. Claire led the way, using her map and flashlight to guide us through the darkness. The creature followed, its eyes glowing in the distance, its guttural growls echoing through the canyons. We finally reached the car just as dawn broke. As we drove away, I looked back and saw it standing on a ridge, watching us. It didn't follow, but its presence lingered, heavy and malevolent. Eli's wound became infected, leaving him bedridden for weeks. He refuses to talk about what he saw that night. Claire moved to another state, saying she never wanted to set foot in New Mexico again. As for me, I abandoned my thesis on Navajo mythology. Some stories aren't meant to be uncovered. If you ever find yourself in the Bisty Wilderness, take my advice. Stay away from the shadows, and whatever you do, don't answer if you hear your name. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 29, a wildlife photographer, and this happened just a few months ago. I'd been working on a new book about the untamed beauty of America's wild places, but I was behind schedule and out of inspiration. To fix that, I decided to take my RV into Gila National Forest in New Mexico, a place I'd heard was rugged, remote, and full of rare wildlife. I'd traveled solo many times before, but this trip was different. This time, I found something I can't explain, and even now, I'm not sure I escaped it completely. I arrived at the forest in late afternoon. The first thing that struck me was how vast and quiet it was, with towering pines and dense undergrowth that seemed to swallow the sunlight. I parked my RV near a trailhead that led into the deeper parts of the forest and set up camp. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. Before heading out, I stopped at a small gas station on the edge of the forest to pick up a few supplies. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Cassidy, looked like she belonged in a place like this: wrinkled skin, sharp eyes, and an air of suspicion. "You camping out here?" she asked as she handed me a bag of snacks. "Yeah," I said. "I'm a photographer, hoping to get some shots of the wildlife." Her expression darkened. "Be careful where you go. The forest doesn't take kindly to strangers. And don't go stirring up what you don't understand." I chuckled awkwardly. "I'll keep that in mind." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say there's a witch in these woods. You hear her whispers, you run. Don't look back." I forced a smile and left quickly, shaking my head at her warning. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a few miles, snapping photos of birds, flowers, and the rugged cliffs that framed the forest. The air was crisp, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. That night, as I sat outside the RV editing my photos, I noticed how the forest seemed to change after dark. The chirping of insects and the calls of owls stopped, leaving a heavy silence. I told myself it was just the forest settling down for the night, but it felt wrong. I went to bed early, locking the RV door behind me. The second day, I ventured deeper into the forest, following a narrow trail that wound between the trees. Around midday, I came across something strange: symbols carved into the bark of several trees. They were intricate, almost like runes, and looked fresh. I snapped a few photos, feeling a small thrill at the discovery. But as I continued, I found more of them. On trees, on rocks, even scratched into the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I woke to a noise outside the RV. It sounded like footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the vehicle. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. Then came the whispering. At first, it was faint, like the wind brushing through leaves. But as I sat frozen in the dark, it grew louder, more distinct. "Laura!" My blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, shining the beam outside. The forest was empty, and I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. On the third day, I met Ethan Morales, a park ranger who was hiking the same trail. He was in his mid-30s, with a friendly but serious demeanor. "You're the photographer staying near the trailhead, right?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "How'd you know?" "Not many people camp out this far. Just wanted to warn you, this forest can be tricky. People get lost out here all the time, and not everyone comes back." His words gave me pause, but I didn't tell him about the whispers. "Thanks for the warning," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just be careful," he said. "And if you see anything strange, get out of there. Don't stick around to investigate." That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I found a narrow, overgrown path that wasn't marked on my map. It led to a clearing where a small cabin stood, its walls weathered and overgrown with moss. I should have turned back, but my curiosity got the better of me. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. The inside was dark and smelled of rot. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with jars containing what looked like dried herbs and animal bones. In the center of the room was a table with a single large book resting on it. Its cover was cracked leather, and the pages were filled with strange symbols similar to the ones I'd seen on the trees. As I reached out to touch the book, a voice whispered in my ear, "Don't." I whipped around, but the cabin was empty. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the shadows seemed to move. I ran out of the cabin and back to the RV, my chest heaving. That night, the forest came alive. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I heard laughter, high-pitched and eerie, like children playing a cruel game. Then came the knocking. It started as a faint tap on the RV's door, then grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stood frozen in the dark, waiting for it to stop. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing there. But in the dirt outside, I saw footprints, bare and small, like those of a child. By the fourth day, I was ready to leave. I packed up my gear and started the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, but it was dead. Desperate, I decided to hike back to the main road and find help. As I made my way through the forest, the whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. The symbols on the trees seemed to glow faintly, and I felt the forest closing in around me. Then I saw her. A figure in a black robe stood ahead, her face obscured by a hood. She didn't move, but I felt her gaze piercing through me. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice cold and sharp. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and scrambled to my feet. When I looked up, she was gone. I ran back to the RV, tears streaming down my face. As I slammed the door shut, I saw something glinting on the dashboard. A small, rusted amulet I'd never seen before. I didn't know where it came from, but I clutched it tightly. The whispers stopped. I tried the engine one last time, and to my relief, it roared to life. Without looking back, I drove out of the forest, my hands shaking on the wheel. I haven't returned to Gila National Forest since that trip. The photos I took are still on my hard drive, but I can't bring myself to look at them. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispers again. They're faint, but they're there. And I know the forest hasn't forgotten me. My name is Daniel Flores. I'm 32, a freelance writer and amateur historian, and this happened in the spring of 2023. I'd been struggling with a creative block for months, and my finances were running low. To clear my head and gather material for a new project, I decided to take my RV out to the Organ Mountains in New Mexico. The Organ Mountains are jagged peaks, their sharp ridges cutting into the sky like the teeth of some ancient beast. The area is steeped in legend: Spanish conquistadors, lost gold, curses. I'd read about the stories as a kid and always wanted to visit. I thought the isolation might inspire me, but I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping behind the mountains and casting long shadows over the desert. I found a quiet spot near the base of the range to park the RV and set up camp. It was eerily quiet, just the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant call of a hawk. Before heading out to explore, I stopped at a roadside gift shop run by a local woman named Maria Ortega. The shop was a small, dusty place, cluttered with turquoise jewelry, old postcards, and what she claimed were genuine artifacts. "You're here for the mountains, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, just doing some research," I replied. She reached under the counter and pulled out a hand-drawn map. "This is what you're looking for." The map was crude but detailed enough to show a hidden canyon deeper in the range. "What's this?" I asked, tracing the lines with my finger. "Where the Spanish hid their gold," she said. "But don't be fooled, it's cursed. Many have gone looking for it, none have returned." I laughed nervously, but something in her eyes told me she wasn't joking. Still, I bought the map. Back at camp, I studied it by the glow of a lantern. The markings didn't make much sense at first, but I thought I could figure it out with some careful exploration. The first hike wasn't too bad, hot, dry, and full of sharp rocks, but manageable. I didn't find anything remarkable, though. That night, as I sat outside my RV, staring at the peaks silhouetted against the stars, I heard it for the first time. Laughter. It was faint, like children playing somewhere far off. I looked around, but the desert was empty. Just the wind, I thought. Still, the sound unsettled me enough that I locked the RV door before going to bed. The next day, I ventured deeper into the mountains. The map seemed to lead me into a narrow canyon, its entrance hidden by boulders. As I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. I followed the path to a clearing where I found something that made my breath catch. An old stone altar, half buried in dirt and surrounded by shards of pottery. On the altar were a few tarnished coins, their edges worn smooth. Spanish gold. My heart raced as I picked one up, feeling its surprising weight. As I held it, the air around me seemed to shift. The wind stopped, and everything went still. "Find it," a voice whispered behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Just the rocks and the empty canyon. That night, back at the RV, the unease grew. I couldn't stop thinking about the altar and the coins. What if Maria's map was real? What if there was more gold? As I lay in bed, I heard the laughter again, closer this time. Then came the whispers. "Danny, come play." I bolted upright, my skin crawling. The sound was coming from outside the RV. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. At first, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the beam, a small figure appeared. A child. He stood motionless, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, his face pale and expressionless. When I blinked, he was gone. The next day, I ran into another camper, a man named Ben Parker. He was in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and the wild-eyed look of someone who'd spent too much time alone. He claimed to be searching for the same treasure I was. "It's out there," he said, his voice low. "I've seen the signs, but it's not what you think." "What do you mean?" I asked. "It doesn't belong to us. The more you take, the more it takes from you." I wanted to dismiss him as a crackpot, but the look in his eyes made me pause. The third night was the worst. I woke to the sound of something moving inside the RV. My flashlight revealed nothing, but when I checked the door, I found small handprints smeared on the glass, too small to belong to an adult. Terrified, I decided to return to the altar the next morning and leave the coin behind. As I hiked back into the canyon, I felt like I was being followed. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, and the whispers grew louder. By the time I reached the altar, my nerves were shot. I placed the coin back on the stone and whispered, "I'm sorry." The wind picked up suddenly, swirling dust around me. The whispers turned into screams, and I saw them. Children, dozens of them, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. They surrounded me, their faces twisted with anger and sadness. "Leave," they said in unison, their voices echoing in my skull. I stumbled back, tripping over a rock, and ran as fast as I could. Behind me, the canyon seemed to collapse in on itself, the rocks shifting and sealing off the path. I made it back to the RV just as a storm rolled in, lightning illuminating the mountains in brief, blinding flashes. The handprints on the glass were gone, but the memory of those children remained etched in my mind. The next morning, I drove to Maria's shop, pale and shaken. She took one look at me and nodded. "You listened," she said. "Most don't." I never told anyone the full story, but I wrote a novel inspired by it, a fictionalized account of the cursed gold and the children who protect it. It sold well, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the laughter, and I wonder if I left the curse behind, or if it's still with me, waiting. My name is Emma Rodriguez. I'm 28, a graduate geology student, and this happened in the summer of 2022. I thought I was prepared for anything the unforgiving landscapes of El Malpais National Monument in New Mexico could throw at me. Jagged lava fields, twisting caves, and the biting solitude of the desert. I was wrong. This story isn't about geology. It's about something far older and darker than the rocks I came to study. It started as an academic trip. I was researching the lava tube formations in El Malpais, hoping to uncover insights for my thesis. It's a stark, alien place, blackened rock stretching for miles, shaped by ancient volcanic activity. Few people venture far into the monument. That isolation was part of the draw. My boyfriend, Mike Larson, came along to keep me company. Mike's 30, a wannabe influencer who saw the trip as a chance to grow his channel. I loved him, but his laid-back attitude often clashed with my focus. To navigate the rugged terrain, we hired Jake Rivera, a local guide in his 40s. Jake knew the land like the back of his hand, but he was superstitious, always muttering warnings about staying on marked trails and respecting the spirits of the land. The locals call this place cursed, Jake told us, as we drove the RV into the heart of the monument. "Too many people disappear out here. You should stick to the trails, Emma." I smiled politely, but didn't answer. I wasn't here for ghost stories. By the time we reached our first site, the sun was a harsh glare overhead. The terrain was brutal. Black rock sharp enough to tear through boots, twisted by ancient eruptions. We hiked to a cave I'd marked on my map, but when we arrived, it didn't match the GPS coordinates. My map was outdated, throwing us off course. Mike's mood soured when his drone malfunctioned. "This thing cost me $1,000," he grumbled. swatting at it as it hovered wildly before crashing into the rocks. Great start to the adventure. Jake was quiet, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said, pointing to a wall of dark clouds gathering to the west. "We should set up camp now." We made it to a flat patch of land just as the storm broke. Rain pelted the RV and lightning illuminated the jagged landscape. I heard Jake muttering a prayer under his breath. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Storms bring them out," he said. When I asked what he meant, he shook his head. "Never mind." The first sign of trouble came that night. I woke to the sound of scratching, a slow, deliberate noise against the RV's metal walls. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard footsteps outside, crunching over the rocks. "Mike," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned. Probably just Jake checking the perimeter. But Jake was still in his bunk. I peered out the small window and froze. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the campfire's dying glow. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture hunched. When it turned toward the RV, I ducked out of sight. The scratching started again, louder this time. I thought my heart might stop. "Who's out there?" Mike shouted, throwing open the door. The figure was gone. The next morning, I dismissed it as paranoia. Sleep deprivation, maybe. Mike and I argued as we packed our gear for the next site. "Why do you always have to push so hard?" he snapped. "Maybe Jake's right. We shouldn't be out here." "This is my research," I shot back. "If you're scared, go home." Jake intervened, his voice tense. "We shouldn't go deeper into the lava tubes. Something's not right." But I didn't listen. The cave we reached that afternoon was breathtaking. A hidden chamber of glittering obsidian walls and strange, geometric formations. As I snapped photos, I noticed something unusual. Symbols etched into the rock, spirals and shapes I didn't recognize. Jake saw them too and went pale. "Time to leave," he said. "Why?" I asked. "This is sacred ground," he replied. "I shouldn't have brought you here." Mike, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "Sacred or not, it'll make a great shot for the vlog." As we left the cave, I felt a chill despite the heat. It was as if the air itself had grown heavy, oppressive. That night, things escalated. As we sat around the campfire, the sounds began again. Whispers just beyond the light, low and guttural. Jake stood abruptly, his hand on his knife. "We're being watched," he said. Mike laughed nervously. "By what? Coyotes?" Jake didn't answer. Around midnight, I woke to Mike screaming. His tent was empty, and his voice echoed from the darkness. "Emma, help!" Jake and I ran toward the sound, our flashlights cutting through the blackness. We found Mike kneeling in the dirt, trembling. "It was you," he whispered when he saw me. "You were calling me." "No, I wasn't," I said. The final night was the worst. We decided to leave at first light, but the land had other plans. Around 3 a.m., I woke to find the RV door wide open. Jake was gone. Mike and I followed his tracks to the edge of a cliff. That's when we saw it. The figure from before, standing in the distance. Its eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers. Jake appeared from the shadows, holding something in his hands, a pouch of herbs, a small firebrand. He began chanting in a language I didn't understand. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "Keeping it away from you," he said. "Now go, run." The figure moved closer, its form shifting. One moment it was human. The next, it was something animal-like, crawling on all fours. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it were being controlled by unseen strings. Mike and I ran, the sounds of chanting and growling filling the night. Behind us, the creature let out a terrible, guttural scream. By dawn, we reached the ranger station, filthy and shaken. Jake never came back. The rangers searched for him but found no trace. Mike's footage from the trip was corrupted, every frame showing static or distorted images. My notes, my photos, everything was gone. It was as if the land had erased our presence. I left New Mexico a different person, haunted by what we'd seen. I gave up my research on El Malpais, but sometimes late at night I hear whispers in my dreams. Whispers in my own voice. My name is Ethan Calder, and I'm 35 years old. This happened last October, during one of those weeks where the desert nights feel endless, and the stars seem too far away to reach. I had just started my nomadic journey, living out of my RV, searching for solitude. My divorce had been finalized a few months earlier, and the weight of it was still heavy on my chest. I thought Villanueva State Park in New Mexico, with its tranquil cliffs and the winding Pecos River, might help me find some peace. Instead, I found something else, something I can't explain, and something I wish I could forget. The drive to the park was uneventful, just me and the drone of the RV's engine. I pulled in late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the ochre cliffs. I picked a spot near the river, about a mile from a thicket the locals called Devil's Hollow. I didn't think much of the name at the time, though I remembered the park ranger's warning when I checked in. "People say it's cursed," she said, her voice low like she didn't want anyone else to hear. "Stay clear of it. Strange things happen there." I nodded politely and waved her off, chalking it up to local superstition. That was my first mistake. After setting up camp, I decided to stretch my legs and explore. The air was crisp, and the canyon walls glowed red in the fading light. As I walked along the riverbank, I saw him, a boy no older than 10, sitting on a rock by the water. He was thin, pale, and dressed in a shirt that seemed too big for him. His dark eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a twinge of unease. "Hey, kid," I called out, "you okay?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head like he was trying to figure me out. Then he spoke, his voice calm and clear. "I'm lost," he said. "Can I stay with you tonight?" Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just leave him there. I nodded and gestured for him to follow me back to the campsite. Back at the RV, I tried to get more information out of him, but he was frustratingly vague. "What's your name?" I asked as I handed him a bottle of water. He stared at me for a moment before answering. "I don't remember." "You don't remember your name?" I frowned. "What about your family? Where are they?" "They're gone," he said simply, taking a sip of water. His tone was so matter-of-fact that it left no room for further questioning. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the boy had fallen silent. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while I prepared a simple meal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. He was too calm, too composed for a child who claimed to be lost. And then there was the humming, a low, tuneless sound that started softly but grew louder as the night went on. I didn't realize at first that it was coming from him. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you humming?" He stopped abruptly and looked at me. "It's a song my mom used to sing." Something about the melody tugged at my memory, but I couldn't place it. I decided not to press further. That night, I woke to the sound of distant laughter. It was faint, almost like the wind was carrying it, but it was unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The boy was still by the fire, his back to me. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls, and I could have sworn I heard my name woven into it. "Ethan!" I shivered and stepped outside the RV. "Do you hear that?" I asked the boy. He didn't turn around. "It's just the wind," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. But it wasn't just the wind, I knew it. The sound was too deliberate, too human. The next morning, the boy insisted we hike to Devil's Hollow. He claimed his family might be there, though he still wouldn't explain how he'd ended up alone in the first place. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I couldn't just leave him wandering around by himself. The trail to the hollow was overgrown, the trees closing in on either side like a tunnel. The air grew colder the closer we got, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then the trail began to shift. Landmarks I'd passed minutes earlier reappeared as if I were walking in circles. My compass spun uselessly, and the trees seemed to lean toward us, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. "Something's not right," I said, stopping in my tracks. "We should turn back." The boy didn't answer. He just kept walking, his pace steady and deliberate. I hesitated, torn between following him and running back to the RV. Before I could decide, the trees opened up, revealing the hollow. The entrance to the hollow was a gaping maw in the earth, surrounded by jagged rocks and overgrown vines. It exuded a sense of wrongness, like the air itself was heavier here. I hesitated at the edge, my instincts screaming at me to leave. "This is it," the boy said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't place. Satisfaction? Malice? I took a step forward and the ground shifted beneath my feet. Suddenly, I was no longer in the forest. I was back in my old house, standing in the kitchen with my ex-wife, Sarah. She was yelling at me, her face twisted with anger, but the words didn't match her mouth. They were distorted, fragmented, like a broken record. "You left me," she said, her voice overlapping with itself. "You're always running." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." The scene dissolved, and I was back in the hollow. The boy was watching me, a faint smile on his lips. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "You brought yourself here," he said. "I'm just showing you the truth." The hollow was alive with shadows, twisting and writhing like living things. I tried to run, but every path led me back to the same spot. The boy was always there, watching, his expression unreadable. "You can't leave," he said, "not until you let it in." "Let what in?" I shouted. He pointed behind me. I turned, and there it was, a figure standing in the darkness. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face featureless except for a gaping mouth. It radiated malice, a hunger that made my skin crawl. It stepped closer, its movements unnaturally jerky, and I realized with growing horror that it was mimicking my movements. Every step I took, it mirrored. Every breath I drew, it echoed. "Stop it!" I yelled, backing away. But it didn't stop. It kept coming, its mouth stretching wider, as if it was about to consume me whole. I don't know how I found the strength to fight back. Maybe it was pure survival instinct. Or maybe it was the realization that this thing fed on fear, on regret. I forced myself to focus, to ground myself in reality. I thought of the RV, the fire, the stars, anything but the hollow. The shadows began to waver, the figure flickering like a dying flame. I stumbled toward the sound of rushing water, following it like a lifeline. The boy's voice called after me, but I didn't look back. When I emerged from the hollow, the sun was rising. The boy was gone, and the forest felt normal again. I didn't wait to see if the entity would follow. I ran back to the RV, started the engine, and drove until the park was miles behind me. It wasn't until I stopped at a gas station that I noticed the photo. It was tucked into my hiking bag, a picture of me as a child standing by the Pecos River, and next to me was the boy, his dark eyes staring back at the camera. I don't know how it got there. I don't want to know. All I know is that Devil's Hollow is real, and whatever lives there isn't done with me. Not yet. My name is Ellie Garcia, and I'm 32 years old. This happened last spring during what should have been an exciting adventure in New Mexico's Rio Grande Gorge. I was there to work on a feature for an outdoor adventure magazine, showcasing hidden gems for camping. I never expected the canyon to have secrets of its own, secrets that would haunt me long after I left. It was late afternoon when I arrived at the campsite, a remote spot overlooking the gorge. The sky was a brilliant blue, the cliffs glowed red in the sunlight, and the winding river below reflected the sky like a mirror. It was the kind of view that made you feel small in the best way. I parked my RV near a trailhead and grabbed my camera, eager to capture the scenery before the light faded. On the drive up, I'd stopped at a small gas station to refuel. The attendant, an older man with leathery skin and a cautious demeanor, had warned me in a low voice, "Stay out of the canyon when it speaks." I'd laughed nervously, thinking he was just messing with me. What does that mean? He'd shrugged and handed me my change. "You'll know if it happens. Just don't listen too closely." The words lingered in the back of my mind as I hiked along the canyon's edge. The wind rushed through the gorge, carrying with it a low, almost musical sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind bouncing off the rock walls, but as I walked further, the sound grew distinct. Soft whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I shook it off as my imagination. The first real sign that something was off came as I set up camp. I'd found a flat spot not far from the trail and built a small fire for the evening. The sun was setting, casting the canyon in deep shadows. I was reviewing my photos when I noticed something strange in one of the shots. A figure, faint and blurry, standing near the edge of the cliffs. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. The site was miles from the nearest town, and no other vehicles had been at the trailhead. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was a trick of the light. As I sat by the fire, I heard it again, the whispers. This time, they were clearer, like voices carried on the wind. They weren't distinct enough to make out words, but they felt intentional. I told myself it was just the wind again and turned in for the night, though I struggled to fall asleep. I woke before dawn to find the fire completely extinguished. That was odd. I banked it carefully before going to bed. The whispers were louder now, circling the RV like invisible visitors. They seemed to call my name, though I told myself that couldn't be true. "Just the wind," I whispered to myself. "Just the wind." Later that morning, I met James. I was hiking along a ridge, trying to shake the unease from the night before, when I spotted him sitting on a boulder near the edge of the canyon. He was dressed simply, in jeans and a faded flannel shirt, and had an air of melancholy about him. "Morning," I called, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. He turned and smiled faintly. "You're brave, coming out here alone." "Part of the job," I said, lifting my camera. "I'm writing a feature on camping spots." "Hope you're not planning to recommend this one," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "The canyon doesn't like visitors." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the gorge. "You've heard them, haven't you? The whispers?" My heart skipped a beat. "You've heard them too?" He nodded. "Everyone who comes here does. The canyon's cursed or haunted, depends on who you ask. People have gone missing, And those who come back, well, they're never quite the same. I wanted to laugh it off, but his expression made it impossible. "Why are you here then?" I asked. He shrugged. "Got nowhere else to go, besides, I like the quiet." Something about him felt off. He seemed too calm, too detached, but I was grateful for the company. That night, the whispers turned into voices. They weren't just faint murmurs anymore. They were distinct and clear, though they didn't make sense. Some were angry, others pleading, but all of them felt directed at me. "Ellie?" The sound of my name made my skin crawl. I stepped out of the RV, flashlight in hand, and scanned the area. The light caught movement near the edge of the gorge. A figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. "James?" I called, though I knew it wasn't him. The figure turned slowly, but before I could get a good look, it vanished into the shadows. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up my gear and started the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, though I'd had no issues with it the day before. My phone had no signal, and the nearest help was hours away on foot. I was stuck. James appeared again, as if out of nowhere. "You can't leave," he said, his voice soft but firm. "What do you mean?" I snapped, panic rising. "The battery's dead." "Did you do this?" He shook his head. "It's not me. It's the canyon. It doesn't let go once it has you." "That's ridiculous," I said, though deep down I wasn't sure I believed it. "This is just a coincidence." He gave me a sad smile. "Keep telling yourself that." I spent the day trying to hike out, but every trail looped back to the campsite. The landmarks I'd memorized, the twisted juniper tree, the boulder shaped like a skull, kept reappearing in the wrong places. The whispers followed me louder now, and I began to hear footsteps that didn't belong to me. James appeared again as the sun began to set. "You'll only get lost," he said. "The canyon doesn't like when people try to leave." "Why are you doing this?" I shouted. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the gorge. "It's waiting." That night, the canyon revealed its true power. The voices filled the air, a chaotic symphony of fear and anger. My name was repeated over and over, growing louder until it was deafening. Shadows moved outside the RV, circling like predators. James appeared one final time. He stood at the edge of the gorge, his face pale and expressionless. "Join me," he said, his voice echoing in my head. "It's easier that way." I felt the pull, an almost physical force drawing me toward the edge. My legs moved without my consent, and panic surged through me. "No!" I screamed, planting my feet. The whispers turned to shrieks and the shadows lunged toward me. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, forcing myself to remember who I was, why I was here. Slowly, the pull weakened and the shadows retreated. When I opened my eyes, James was gone. At dawn, the RV started as if nothing had happened. I didn't question it. I drove away as fast as the narrow dirt road would allow, not stopping until the canyon was miles behind me. I never wrote the article. I told my editor the trip had been a bust and moved on to other assignments. But I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet. And I can't shake the feeling that the canyon is still watching, waiting for me to return. My name is Lila Rivera, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in late October, just as the cool desert nights began settling in over Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. I still can't bring myself to talk about it openly, but writing feels safer, like putting it all in a box and sealing the lid. Maybe, if I do this, the whispers will stop. It started as an adventure, nothing unusual for me. I'm a freelance archaeologist working on an independent study, and the canyon ruins had always fascinated me. My goal was to document petroglyphs and link them to regional folklore. My best friend Zane, 30, joined me on the trip as a photographer. Zane had a knack for making even the dullest landscapes look dramatic, and I knew his images would add weight to my paper. At the last minute, my cousin Jasmine, Jazz, tagged along. Jazz was 27 and loved hiking, though she didn't hide her unease about the area. She grew up hearing her grandmother's stories about spirits that roamed the desert, witches who cursed the unwary, and creatures that weren't quite human. "Chaco's bad news," Jazz said as we loaded gear into my RV. "We shouldn't be messing with stuff we don't understand." I laughed her off, though I noticed Zane rolling his eyes in the background. The drive was long, with stretches of empty highway and sagebrush. We reached the edge of the canyon by late afternoon and found a remote campsite. It was perfect, far enough from other campers to feel isolated but still accessible by a dirt road. The sandstone cliffs loomed in the distance, glowing red in the fading light. Jazz stepped out of the RV and looked around nervously. "This place feels off," she muttered. "Come on," Zane said, slinging his camera bag over his shoulder. "It's just a canyon. You're letting stories mess with your head." We spent the first few hours exploring the immediate area. I was thrilled to find petroglyphs etched into rocks near the campsite. Ancient spirals, animals, and humanoid figures. Some markings didn't match the typical Puebloan style, though. They looked newer, rougher, like they'd been scratched hastily into the stone. "Probably just modern graffiti," Zane said, snapping pictures. Jazz didn't comment. That night, things began to unravel. We set up camp just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The temperature dropped quickly, and Zane struggled to rig the tent. One of the poles was bent, leaving the structure lopsided and unstable. Jazz insisted we sleep in the RV, but Zane refused, saying the tent would complete the experience. Dinner was tense. Jazz kept glancing over her shoulder, muttering about how quiet it was. Too quiet. The desert silence pressed down on us, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the sagebrush. "I'm telling you," Jazz said, poking at her food, "we're being watched." "By what?" Zane asked, smirking. "Coyotes? A jackrabbit?" Jazz glared at him. "You don't get it. This land isn't just empty space. People lived here, died here. There are things that never left." "Okay, enough," I said, trying to diffuse the tension. "Let's focus on the reason we're here. Zane, we'll need good lighting for those petroglyphs tomorrow. Jazz, can you help me catalog the markings?" Jazz nodded reluctantly, but the unease didn't leave her eyes. The first sign of something wrong came that night. I woke around midnight to a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I sat up, listening. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. It was coming from outside the tent. "Zane," I whispered, shaking his shoulder, "do you hear that?" He grumbled and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What now?" Scratch, scratch. His face hardened. "Probably a raccoon," he said, grabbing his flashlight. "I'll scare it off." "Wait," I started, but he was already unzipping the tent. The cold air rushed in as Zane stepped out, shining his light around. "See? Nothing." I followed cautiously, the beam of my own flashlight sweeping the ground. The desert stretched out in all directions, empty and still. But then I saw them. Footprints in the sand circling our campsite. They weren't human. The prints were too large, with long, claw-like impressions. "What the hell?" Zane muttered, crouching to inspect them. Jazz emerged from the RV, wrapped in a blanket. Her face paled when she saw the tracks. "I told you," she whispered, "we're not alone." The whispering began the next day. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the wind. I thought I was imagining it until Jazz grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Zane called from a few feet away. Jazz looked at me, eyes wide. "It said my name." We tried to focus on the ruins that morning, but the tension was palpable. Zane wandered off with his camera, muttering about the perfect shot, while Jazz stuck close to me. She refused to enter certain areas, claiming the air felt heavy, wrong. By afternoon, I started hearing the whispers too. My name, carried on the wind, low and guttural. "Lila." I spun around, expecting to see Zane or Jazz, but no one was there. That night was worse. We built a fire near the RV, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. Jazz refused to leave the vehicle, sitting inside with her back to the door. Zane, ever the skeptic, decided to venture out alone after dinner, chasing what he claimed was the perfect shot of the moonlit ruins. "Are you insane?" Jazz snapped. "You saw those tracks. You heard the voices." "Relax," he said, smirking. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. He wasn't. We found him an hour later. Jazz and I followed his footprints to the edge of the ruins, where they abruptly stopped. We called his name, the sound echoing eerily off the canyon walls. Then we heard it, his voice, calling for help. "Lila, Jazz, over here!" It was coming from deeper in the ruins. "Zane?" I shouted. But something about his voice sounded off. The pitch was wrong, the tone distorted. Jazz grabbed my arm, shaking her head. "That's not him," she whispered. I didn't want to believe her, but my gut told me she was right. We turned back, intending to return to the RV and wait for dawn, but then we saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face pale and elongated, with black pits where its eyes should have been. It mimicked Zane's voice again. "Help me!" Jazz screamed, and I froze, unable to move. The creature took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Fire," Jazz whispered, snapping me out of my trance. "Keep the fire burning." We threw everything we could onto the flames, watching as the creature hissed and retreated into the darkness. We found Zane's body at dawn. It was half buried in a shallow pit near the ruins, bloodied and broken. His camera was gone, and his face was frozen in a mask of terror. Jazz and I didn't speak as we packed up the RV, driving away as fast as the dirt road allowed. I still hear his voice sometimes, calling my name in the wind. And I can't help but wonder if that thing is still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its domain. My name is Claire Thompson, and I was 36 when it happened. This was supposed to be a healing journey, a chance to find myself again after losing my husband, Aaron, in a car accident 6 months ago. Instead, it became a nightmare that I still can't fully comprehend. This happened in Cibola National Forest, New Mexico, near the Sandia Mountains. Aaron loved this place. He always talked about how peaceful and beautiful it was. I thought spending a week here alone would help me reconnect with him, or at least with the memory of who I was when I was with him. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my RV at a remote campsite near a trailhead leading to a small, hidden lake Aaron and I once visited. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks catching the orange glow of the setting sun. After setting up camp, I unpacked my easel and paints. I was an artist by trade, and this trip was as much about creating as it was about grieving. Painting always brought me clarity, and I hoped the stillness of the forest would inspire me. But the forest wasn't as quiet as I remembered. There was a heaviness to the air, as if the trees were holding their breath. That night, as I sat by the fire, I began sketching the jagged outline of the Sandia Mountains. The fire crackled softly, and I tried to focus on the comforting rhythm of pencil on paper. But then I noticed it. Movement, just at the edge of the firelight. I froze, the pencil slipping from my fingers. My eyes darted to the trees, where faint shadows seemed to shift. "It's just your imagination," I whispered to myself. I returned to the sketch, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The fire's warmth suddenly felt suffocating, and I retreated inside the RV for the night. I woke abruptly to the sound of footsteps circling the RV. Not animal footsteps. These were deliberate, heavy, and human-like. "Aaron," I said instinctively, half asleep. The footsteps stopped. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and shone it through the window. The forest was still. Too still. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease and focused on my painting. I set up my easel near the trailhead, aiming to capture the golden light filtering through the pines. As I worked, I noticed something strange. My brush seemed to move on its own, adding dark shapes to the painting that I hadn't intended. Shadowy figures began to emerge among the trees in my work, their forms elongated and unnatural. I stared at the painting, my stomach twisting. I hadn't planned to include those shapes, yet they felt deliberate. "It's just your grief," I muttered, trying to ground myself. "You're imagining things." But when I turned to pack up my supplies, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing among the trees. Its silhouette blended with the shadows, but its presence was unmistakable. I called out, "Hello, who's there?" The figure didn't move. Grabbing my gear, I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, as I tried to sleep, the radio in the RV crackled to life. Static filled the air, followed by faint whispers. At first, I thought it was interference, but then I heard my name. Claire. It was Aaron's voice, distorted but unmistakable. I sat up, clutching the blanket. "Aaron! Is that you?" The whispers grew louder, overlapping, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Then, as suddenly as it started, the radio went silent. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to close my eyes. The next day, I decided to hike to the lake. I told myself I needed to get out of the RV, that the fresh air would clear my head, but deep down, I felt drawn to the trail, as if something, or someone, was pulling me there. The hike was grueling, the trail overgrown and difficult to follow. My compass spun erratically and my phone had no signal. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was low on the horizon. The water was eerily still, reflecting the blood-red sky. I set up my easel to paint, but my hands trembled as I worked. Then I saw it again. The figure. It stood across the lake, its elongated limbs unnaturally still. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, featureless and dark. My breath caught in my throat. "What do you want?" I shouted. The figure didn't respond, but the air grew colder. I felt an overwhelming sense of despair, as if the creature was feeding off my grief. Panicking, I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV. That night, the shadow walker came for me. I was inside the RV, barricaded with every light on, when I heard the footsteps again. They were heavier this time, more deliberate. Then, a knock at the door. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder. "Claire," a voice whispered. Faint, but clear. It was Aaron's voice, but something about it felt wrong. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched Aaron's photo. "Leave me alone!" I screamed. The lights flickered, and a cold shadow crept under the door. The shadow walker was inside. It towered over me, its limbs impossibly long, its presence suffocating. The air felt thick with despair, and I collapsed to my knees, clutching Aaron's photo. "Aaron, please," I whispered, "help me." A sudden gust of wind blew through the RV, knocking over the lights and scattering my paintings. The shadow walker recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. Then it was gone. At dawn, I left Cibola National Forest. I didn't pack everything, I didn't care, I just needed to leave. When I reached Albuquerque, I tried to make sense of what happened. I told myself it was just grief and isolation playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. A week later, a package arrived at my apartment. It contained my painting of the lake and a shadowy figure standing among the trees. I burned it. I haven't gone back to the forest, and I don't think I ever will. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some shadows aren't meant to be chased. My name is Evan Cross, and I was 29 when it happened. I wasn't new to traveling alone. I'd been doing it for years, filming vlogs about the wild places I visited. But this happened in the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument in New Mexico, and it changed everything. I haven't stepped foot into the wilderness since. At the time, I was chasing views and trying to rebuild my life. I had lost my job as a journalist months earlier and started documenting outdoor adventures to make ends meet. People loved stories, and the Organ Mountains had one, the lost padre's treasure. Gold hidden for centuries, guarded by the spirits of those who died searching for it. It sounded like nonsense, but I thought it might make a great video. I parked my RV in a pull-off area at the base of the Organ Mountains. The jagged peaks loomed against a bright blue sky, a beautiful but intimidating backdrop. The air was dry and heavy, carrying the faint smell of desert sage. "This is it," I said to the camera, filming my intro. The Organ Mountains, rugged, remote, and full of legends. We're going to follow an old trail today and see if we can find the famous treasure cave. The plan was simple. Hike during the day, camp at night, and document everything. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail was steep and poorly marked, but my GPS kept me on track. Along the way, I found an old rosary hanging from a low tree branch. Its blackened beads looked like they had been burned. "Creepy," I muttered to the camera. "Maybe someone left this as a warning." I laughed, but something about the rosary stuck with me. I returned to my RV as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. After a quick dinner, I sat in the RV, reviewing the day's footage. That's when I noticed the shadows. In the shots I'd filmed at sunset, there were strange movements in the background. Shadows darted across the rocky terrain, but when I paused the video, nothing was there. I leaned closer to the screen, frowning. Probably just tricks of the light, I told myself. Then came the knock. It was soft, like fingertips brushing the side of the RV. I froze, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The desert was still, the moonlight casting long shadows. I circled the RV but saw nothing. As I climbed back in, I noticed something odd. My campfire pit had been reset. The stones arranged in a perfect circle. I couldn't shake the unease, but I pressed on. The next morning, I packed my gear and set out to follow the trail deeper into the mountains. The terrain grew rougher, the trail harder to follow. My GPS flickered, its screen flashing random coordinates before dying completely. "Great," I muttered. I resorted to using my map, but the landmarks didn't match up. It felt like the landscape was shifting, leading me in circles. Around noon, I came across something that made my skin crawl. A footprint. It was barefoot but impossibly large, with elongated toes that looked more like claws. I crouched to examine it, filming the scene. "All right, folks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is getting weird." That evening, I camped in a small clearing surrounded by jagged rocks. I built a fire and tried to shake off the creeping dread. As the flames crackled, the desert grew silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. And then I heard it. A whisper. Faint, like the rustling of leaves, but there were no trees. "Evan," it said. I whipped around, the flashlight beam darting across the darkness. "Who's there?" No response. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't just calling my name, it was praying. The words were in Spanish, soft and rhythmic. I didn't understand them, but they filled me with a cold, sinking dread. I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture the sound, but by the time I hit record, the whispers had stopped. The trail led me to a cave on the third day. It wasn't marked on any map, but it matched the descriptions from the legend. The entrance was a jagged black maw in the mountainside, framed by rocks that seemed to shimmer faintly in the sun. "This is it," I whispered to the camera. "The lost padre's treasure." As I stepped inside, the air grew cold. The walls were covered in scratches, as if someone, or something, had clawed at them in desperation. Further in, I found remnants of past explorers, rusted tools, scraps of cloth, and a journal with brittle yellowed pages. The journal was written in shaky Spanish. It described the author's obsession with the treasure and the growing paranoia that the spirits of the cave were watching him. The final entry read, "They will not let me leave. The gold is cursed." I closed the journal, my hands trembling, and then I saw them. Shadows flickered across the cave walls, moving independently of the light. They solidified into figures, men in tattered clothes, their faces gaunt and hollow. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths moved as if speaking, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my camera. "I don't want your treasure," I shouted. The figures didn't retreat. Instead, they pointed deeper into the cave, their movements jerky and unnatural. Panic took over. I bolted out of the cave, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the sunlight felt oppressive, the jagged peaks looming like watching sentinels. The whispers followed me, growing louder, accusing. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt their meaning. "You've taken something that isn't yours." I didn't stop running until I reached the RV. I jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. The knocking started again, louder this time. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. The RV's headlights illuminated the trail ahead, and the figures standing at the cave entrance. They didn't follow, but they watched, their glowing eyes burning into my memory. Back home in Albuquerque, I tried to move on. I deleted the footage, abandoned my channel, and refused to talk about the trip. But the cave never left me. Weeks later, a package arrived on my doorstep. It contained the journal I'd left behind, and a small gold nugget. The return address was blank. As I opened it, a faint whisper echoed through my apartment. "Evan." I haven't slept since. My name is Lila Martinez, and I was 32 when it happened. It's been 2 years, and I still can't explain what I saw, or what happened to Dan. I've spent countless sleepless nights replaying those 3 days in Valle Vidal, Carson National Forest, New Mexico. Some details blur, but others remain etched in my mind as sharp as broken glass. This happened in the fall of 2022. I was a wildlife biologist working on a research project about bird migration patterns in remote wilderness areas. Valle Vidal was perfect, isolated, pristine, and untouched by modern noise. My boyfriend Dan, 34, decided to join me, not out of interest in my work but to spend time together. I appreciated his effort, even though he teased me mercilessly about my bird obsession. Maya Torres, 27, was our guide. A local herbalist, she knew the trails and the area's quirks. Maya was a mix of earthy wisdom and quiet intensity. She warned us about the region's reputation, something about Navajo legends, but Dan dismissed it as folklore. I wish we had listened to her. We arrived at the trailhead mid-morning. The sky was a deep, endless blue, and the forest was alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves. I felt a rush of excitement as I strapped on my gear. Maya led the way, her pack brimming with dried herbs and her well-worn compass swinging from her neck. "This place has stories," she said casually as we hiked. "Stories?" Dan grinned. "Like Bigfoot? Aliens?" "Skinwalkers," Maya said quietly. Dan laughed. "What, shape-shifting witches? Give me a break." Maya didn't laugh. "You shouldn't mock what you don't understand." I shot her an apologetic look, but she just tightened her jaw and kept walking. By late afternoon, we reached our campsite, a small clearing by a stream. I set up my wildlife cameras while Dan collected firewood. Maya wandered off, muttering about medicinal plants. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew eerily quiet. I didn't notice it at first. I was too busy tinkering with my equipment. But when I realized the usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves had stopped, I froze. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Dan. "Hear what?" he asked, arms full of firewood. "Nothing," I said. "That's the problem." That night, we sat around the fire eating canned chili and listening to the occasional hoot of an owl. Maya was unusually quiet, staring into the flames as if searching for answers. "What's up?" Dan asked her. "You've been weird all day." Maya glanced at me before answering. "The silence. It's wrong. Animals don't go quiet unless they sense something dangerous." "Like what?" Dan asked, his tone half teasing. Maya didn't answer. We turned in early, the fire crackling softly in the dark. I couldn't sleep. The stillness pressed against my ears, and the shadows outside the tent seemed darker than they should have been. Around midnight, I heard something. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling the campsite. "Dan," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he groaned. "Listen." We both held our breath. The footsteps stopped. "It's probably just a deer," he said, rolling over. But I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I found the footprints. Barefoot, human-like, but wrong. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like, and the stride was impossibly long. "Looks like Bigfoot came to visit," Dan joked. Maya didn't laugh. "We need to be careful," she said. "This isn't normal." As we packed up to move deeper into the forest, my GPS started acting up. The screen flickered, and the coordinates jumped wildly. Maya's compass spun in circles, refusing to settle. "Magnetic interference," I suggested, trying to sound rational. Maya's face was pale. "Something's messing with it." Dan rolled his eyes. "It's called bad equipment. Let's keep moving." By midday, a storm rolled in, soaking our gear and ruining the map. We huddled under a tarp, cold and frustrated. Tensions flared. "Why did we even come out here?" Dan snapped. "Your stupid birds aren't worth this." "This isn't my fault," I shot back. "You didn't have to come." "Enough!" Maya said firmly. Arguing won't help. That night, the silence returned, heavier than before. It happened on the third night. We were around the fire again, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. Maya suddenly stiffened, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I followed her gaze. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shape emerged, a figure, tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. It stood just beyond the fire's glow, swaying slightly. "Who's there?" Dan called out. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step closer, its movements jerky and puppet-like. Dan grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the figure. It stepped back into the shadows, but not before I saw its face, or what should have been its face. Its features were smeared, like a poorly drawn mask, and its eyes glowed faintly like dying embers. "Jesus Christ," Dan muttered. Maya began muttering under her breath, something in Spanish, as she pulled a pouch of herbs from her bag. "Do not look it in the eyes," she warned, "and do not speak to it." "What the hell is it?" I whispered. "A skinwalker," Maya said, her voice trembling. We decided to leave immediately. Maya burned a mixture of sage and juniper, saying it would offer some protection. "Stay close," she said. "It wants to separate us." We packed only what we could carry and set off into the night, the fire still smoldering behind us. The forest was pitch black, and every sound made my heart race. The figure followed. Sometimes we saw it, a glimpse of movement in the corner of our eyes, the glow of its eyes in the distance. Other times we heard it, the soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. Then it started mimicking us. At first it was subtle, a cough, a laugh, a whispered word. Then it became more deliberate. "Lila," it called, using Dan's voice. I froze. Dan was beside me, his mouth firmly shut. "Keep moving," Maya urged, her voice low. Dan couldn't take it anymore. "I'm done running from this thing," he shouted, brandishing his hunting knife. "Dan, no!" I screamed, but he ignored me. He charged into the darkness, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the scream, a blood-curdling, inhuman wail that echoed through the forest. "Dan!" I cried, but Maya grabbed my arm. "That's not him," she said firmly. "We have to keep moving." Tears streamed down my face as we stumbled through the woods. At dawn, we emerged from the trees, exhausted and terrified. Dan was never found. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but there was no trace of him. I told the authorities about the figure, but they chalked it up to stress and hallucinations. Sometimes, I hear his voice in my dreams, calling my name. And sometimes, when I wake, I see a figure standing at the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes watching me. I'll never go back to Valle Vidal. Whatever lives there, it doesn't belong in this world. And it doesn't let go.